Restoring Darkness is brought to you by Evluma, illuminating the pursuit of dark skies.
Welcome back to the Restoring Darkness podcast. On today's show, I am joined, and myself and my new co-host, Mark Baker, are joined by Jacqueline Yallop. Jacqueline is the author of 3 novels and 4 works of creative nonfiction. She is currently working on a collection of short stories. She lives in West Wales, where she teaches creative writing at, I'm going to let you say the name, how does that pronounced?
Aberystwyth.
Aberystwyth University.
There are more, yeah.
She's an award-winning author of fiction and creative nonfiction, described as a writer of rare, fine judgment and delicacy. Her latest book, Into the Dark, is out in this month, November 2023. It looks at darkness in all its forms, in science, literature, art, philosophy, and history. Her novel, Obedience, was nominated for the Man Booker Prize. Big Pig, Little Pig, a memoir, was Radio 4 Book of the Week. Her work has been translated into several languages. She has no social media, but there is a web page that references her work, which will be posted to the Restoring Darkness podcast website. So go to restoringdarkness.com. While you're there and while you're listening, I want you to think about a new entity created by over 70 lighting distributors and 25 lighting manufacturers. It's called the Lighting and Darkness Foundation. And we have a new mandate. And that mandate is to mediate and help resolve light trespass disputes, along with the other work of the foundation, which is creating educational programs and actively advocating for the lighting industry to adopt the principles of darkness restoration and night preservation. Because who's going to do the work, folks? If we're going to fix this problem, the lighting industry is going to fix it. That's right. There is no other industry that's going to come along and fix it. If you want to help out, you go to restoringdarkness.com. You click the donate link if you want to donate money. But we could also use some donation of time. We need to fix that website. We need to update that website. So if you're out there and you want to help us out in some way, go to restoringdarkness.com and fill out the connection form or give us some cash, become a monthly donor or something. But we're going to be doing some good work. One more announcement before we move to Jacqueline. Mark Baker, say hello to the Restoring Darkness podcast listeners.
Yeah, hi, Michael. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, no problem. You got to turn down Mark's volume a touch there, Scott, before we move forward. Mark Baker is the executive director of the Soft Lights Foundation. I think that's his exact title. And the Soft Lights Foundation is adjacent to the Lighting and Darkness Foundation, and that it explores the problems, health effects, and all the problems caused by irresponsible outdoor lighting at night. And so Mark and I have found a lot of common ground to the point where I wanted him to come on the podcast and be another voice in this movement. That's a long intro. Usually we go 2 minutes. I went 3 today, but there was a lot of news with Mark joining the show and all the stuff happening at the foundation. Jacqueline, happy to have you here today.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for asking. Thank you for tracking me down, actually. I was very impressed.
Well, I read an article online. One of our producers here, Scott Wachter, he follows the news very closely on this, and he sent me an article from the newspaper talking about your new book. Why don't we just start off from the beginning? Tell me how darkness has different forms. What are the different forms of darkness?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? So one of the things that I'm interested in looking at in the book is how we think about dark physical thing. So obviously, we go out at night and it's dark, and what that experience is and why it might be special and meaningful, but also darkness as perhaps a psychological thing whereby, it's something about our perception of the world, and that's often reflected in language. And we talk about dark moods, for example. So how over time, over history, the idea of darkness has become embedded in our cultures, and why it's become so significant, particularly perhaps in contrast to ideas of light, but not always. So there's that as well. And then alongside that, I suppose it opens up all kinds of ideas around philosophy, religion, race, which is about the idea of darkness perhaps as a metaphor or something that we reach for when we're trying to explain difficult ideas, difficult concepts. Death, for example, the connections between darkness and death are really well established and have been repeated over centuries. So when we're trying to talk about something difficult, like dying or like what might happen after we're dead, that quite often there are references to darkness or ideas around darkness. Think about hymns, for example. Most Christian hymns reference darkness and light in some way, particularly in death. Things like Abide With Me, which is perhaps one of the best known Christian hymns around death and dying.
What was the name of that hymn? You just blipped. Your internet blipped a little bit there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Abide With Me, which
Okay, yes.
certainly, is a popular funeral hymn in the UK. I don't know whether it translates across the world, but it is what a lot of people here would choose as the hymn to go out on.
So these metaphors, in my mind, have in the age of affordable light pollution with LEDs. I think these metaphors should be slowly losing their meaning, because it seems like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. While we're afraid of darkness, and while there's an element of night that invokes a sense of going home, that's because we're not a nocturnal species. And so the fear is natural. We want to go back to our homes, but we're out at night a lot. We have all this electric light, but I think we're throwing out the beautiful things about darkness, the seduction, the sublimity, the spirituality, and all these other things that go along with night and darkness. How do we sort out these metaphorical problems we have?
It's interesting, isn't it, that actually the metaphors, I would say, haven't lost their power. So yes, I agree with you. There's a lot of light out there, but we still use those metaphors of darkness, don't we? We still fall back on them to try and explain what it is that's going on in the world, which I think is quite interesting, that perhaps the way that we use language, the way we think about darkness, isn't necessarily connected to our day-to-day experience of darkness, which is, as you say, about going out in street lights or putting the lights on at home or having a floodlight in your garden or whatever it is. One of the reasons that I started to write the book was because I walk quite a lot in the dark. So the book is structured around my own walking in the dark. And I'm interested in the difference you experience depending on the moon cycle, for example, or depending on whether it's cloudy or the stars are out. You've got a beautiful backdrop to your there with the starry sky. And I was interested in how that, for me, special experience, sensory experience of being out in the dark in different conditions at different times of year, in different weather, in different countries, how that, why that was important to me and how it was being lost, and how it exists as a kind of habitat that is being lost. So we think about, don't we, the problem with ocean pollution, for example, with plastics, or pollution of land with various horrible things. We think about loss of habitat, perhaps, loss of ocean habitat, loss of grassland habitat, whatever it might be. We don't, I think, necessarily think about darkness as a habitat for both us and plants and animals, and how important it is on that basis. And I think that distinction is lost. So people just think of it as something to get rid of, to escape from, to turn a light on to, rather than something that is in itself unique and special and important to all kinds of things, both for us and for other creatures, in terms of our physical and mental well-being. And I think that is lost, or has become more lost as time has gone by. I think one of the things that medieval people, for example, would have been very aware of was the power of night, of being out at night. And they quite possibly chose not to be, because it was quite dangerous and often not allowed through a series of curfews and so on. But nonetheless, they would have been aware of the sort of fundamental power of what it is to be out in the dark. And I think we've lost that, actually. I think people don't often think about it as a powerful habitat.
And I'm in the hazardous waste business as well as the lighting industry. And one of the principles of contamination is how long it takes for the contamination to cause problems. Okay, so for example, if you dump a whole bunch of toxic chemicals into a dump, how long does it take for that to leach into the lake? That can take decades. Actually, groundwater sometimes moves as slow as 3 feet a year, 4 feet a year. It moves very slowly as it moves underground, and the chemicals become part. Light pollution is the same thing. We've slowly increased our light levels in our cities and in different areas, and then we had a technological revolution which made light pollution extremely affordable. And Mark's going to be chomping at the bit here. You're next, Mark, right after this question. You can come in and ask Jacqueline a few things. But as this has gone on, it's been such a slow process that most people haven't even noticed that it's happened, which is one of the reasons why I say there's so many Canadians in this movement, because Canada is largely a dark sky preserve. Most of it's unoccupied. Yeah. And so we often have a chance to experience this nature, whereas most people in the world, they will never see true darkness. Most city dwellers.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And again, I'm very lucky in West Wales. I don't that there are a series of dark sky reserves in West Wales. I'm not sure that we're quite as dark as the wilderness in Canada, but there's the opportunity to see a reasonably unspoilt sky. But I think I'm right in saying that for 80% of the world's population, something like the Milky Way is impossible to see, and I think that's 99% of the population of the United States, for example, and certainly in UK cities, even on a beautifully clear night, the stars are more or less not there. And one of the prompts for writing the book was just because I've been lucky enough to spend time in rural Europe, where there's a very, very dark sky in the place that I was living for a while, and I was on a nightly basis taken aback by what it was possible to sort of see and experience, and the fantastic display you would get for various, the Perseids or whatever it might be with shooting stars, but not just the kind of pure spectacle of that kind of thing, just the everyday glory of looking at starry sky.
Mark.
Hi, Jacqueline. So
Hiya.
so this is really fascinating. Hi, this is really fascinating for me as an advocate for protecting what I call the natural night resource. And so it's interesting to hear you say the habitat, because I haven't heard that phrase before, and it's something I'm going to start thinking about. Habitat. It's absolutely right. But also this natural night is a resource that needs to be protected, just like water as a resource, air as a resource. I was looking at your article in The Guardian, and you mentioned this fear of the dark is actually biologically innate, starting at age 2 and increasing to age 5. And no matter what culture, you said it's built in. So can you talk about this fear? Because in our advocacy work, we see cities wanting to put in lights for safety to sort of, guard against this fear that they have. So we're fighting against something that's innate. Do you feel this fear when you walk out in the woods? Do you still have it? And what can we tell cities about this innate fear, and what can they do about it?
Okay, that's a big question. Let me see if I can unpick it. So first of all, in my own experience, no, I've never been afraid of the dark. I think I've always loved. I mean, possibly when I was very, very young, but not in my conscious memory. I think I've always loved the dark. And one of the things that interested me about writing the book was that when I would talk to people about it, they lots of people would recoil. Oh no, I can't. I'm so frightened. And the editor who was working on the book with me said, I've never thought about the dark like this. I keep the lights on in the house, on low all night. I can't, for my children, for myself, and that fear was new to me, really. So it was quite interesting. What I think is fascinating about that fear that we have as children is that actually it's really important. So for the young child, between, as you say, the ages of sort of 2 and 5, it's important to learn, or it's important to experience a fear of the dark, because it's a way of learning about what the world is, and it's a way of understanding what it is to be human in the world, what might be out there, and how you react to that, how you keep yourself safe. So obviously lots of these fears go back a long time before we are now, but they're still about shaping our position in the world and understanding sort of where we sit. And it's interesting that those fears continue to be evident in children, even though, as we've said, most of us don't experience the dark very much on a daily or nightly basis. So that's kind of some of the bits of an answer. In terms of cities and cityscapes and light pollution, and I think one of the problems that I see, and obviously, I'm not very, I have no, well, actually, that's not true. I was once situated in a county council planning department, but I have very little experience of planning and building architecture, for example. But I think for a long time, lighting something was a building, for example, was seen as a status symbol, wasn't it? It was seen as a way of announcing power, announcing, whatever it might be, the prestige of the city, or whatever, whatever it might happen to be. And I mean, actually, in the book, I spend quite a long time talking about the contrasts between light and dark, and how historically the use of light has been about imposing power. So, the church and the state over a long time have used light as a way of making their position stronger and showing their wealth and their difference from kind of ordinary people who had to live in the darkness. So, and I think that has continued. So the nature of the contemporary city as a sort of fantastic lighted beacon is something that is very hard to overcome. And if you think about, extreme examples like Las Vegas, for example, or some of the sort of big, extremely highly lit cities in China or the Far East, or the Middle East, in fact, as well.
Or North Korea
I
and
think you
South
can see
Korea.
very
North Korea and South Korea are probably the
okay,
best example of light
okay,
pollution as a status symbol.
yeah. Okay, so that I have never been to either, so that's go down on my list. But yeah, exactly that. The use of light to signal all kinds of things beyond the fact that you can see your way to the door to put your key in. So I think you probably have a task on your hands convincing cities to turn their lights off. But I know more people do, don't they? So in Europe, certainly, I know that a lot of European countries, France, Spain, Italy, have either completely done away with or very much reduced the lighting on municipal buildings, and in lighting churches at night, or lighting facades. So that's it's certainly that in villages and towns, when you go in now in Europe, there'll be a sign at the entrance with a little kind of night sky to show that lighting will be turned off when darkness comes down, and that at least is something. And yeah, I mean, I talk in the book as well about. Sorry, go on.
Well, you brought up some fascinating things. I was also thinking of North Korea because when you look at the light pollution maps or you look at the satellite views, you see the world, the modern world lit up at nighttime, and then you see North Korea and it's completely dark. And I sometimes think, wow, that would be so great to live there. Although there's this other political stuff going on that I'm not sure that I would want to live there. But this power thing is absolutely right. So this uplighting that people do on the cities is to show who they are and who we are in this sphere in Las Vegas that cost $1 billion, which does all kinds of things with LEDs. And so convincing cities to sort of dial down the show of power is really difficult. They say maybe it's for safety. They say maybe we have to have that. And the public seems to want that, but they don't realize that the importance of this habitat, the darkness for our health, etc. So it's really hard to convince sort of the public that actually the wiser thing to do would be to actually dial down the light to protect our habitat, to keep it dark. And but then there's this sort of fear. I can tell you personally that even as an adult, I can still walk out, and as much as I want the darkness, I can feel something going at me.
Okay.
That there might be
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
right out there, and it's that I fight it, and I know that the night is natural and something beneficial, but it's still how do we can't overlight.
And I think it's quite interesting that some of the studies that I came across looking at crime at night showed that actually it was less at night than it was in daylight hours. So the perception, as you say, the public perception is that we're less safe at night, whereas actually we're not. Actually, most crime is committed both on the person and on property during daylight hours. So I think that it is a question of getting the message out there and education in some part, and probably as you're trying to do, just helping people appreciate how fantastic it can be to have a little bit more darkness, if not absolute darkness.
The
Do you have
connection. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, I was just trying to expand on the crime thing because that's really also important because the cities will sell the light as a way to combat crime, to make their cities safer. We see it all the time that they're putting in LED streetlights to make the cities safer. Do you have recollection of any of the articles that you've read that sort of demonstrate that that's not true? You referred to one just a minute ago.
Yeah, there is research out there, more than one article, plenty of articles that suggest that actually, while that is usually the argument for new lighting, it doesn't stand up when you look at crime figures and when crimes were committed. And where we live now, actually, they have those lights that kind of dim when no one's walking past and there's no traffic, and then
Sure.
when someone comes past, it's a motion sensor and they light up again. Well, at least that's something. At least there is some concession to darkness, I suppose.
The electric light is neither the cause nor the solution of crime. And so the axiomatic presupposition. I'm not supposed to say that word anymore. I know I've said it too much. The producer's looking at me, but it's a failed one. Okay, it's a straw man argument. So when people say, "Oh, insurance companies, lawyers, legal," they just assume that more light will reduce graffiti or reduce crime, and there's no evidence for this. They're not asked to produce evidence for this. It's simply assumed that if you light the side of this building, people will cease to put graffiti on it. That's not true. There's no proof of that. And so I just walked away from a deal the other day, Mark, where a customer called in. The side of his building was graffitied, and he said, "I want to put up 3 massive lights here." And I said, "That's not going to stop any graffiti." I said, "I'll put the lights up for you, no problem." But I said that there's no evidence that reduces graffiti. And so, we're operating in an environment where there are many assumptions. Is that better, Scott? There are many assumptions that people start off with that have no evidence to back them up, and everybody believes them. And one of those is more light equals more safety, Jacqueline.
I think that's right. And actually, one of the things that I'm interested in, so I'm really a kind of cultural historian and obviously a writer. So I'm interested in art and literature and that kind of thing. And when something bad is about to happen in a film, the lights go down, don't they? tends to happen at night. The kind of concept of people having to survive the night in some kind of film, particularly in crime or horror films, and again in books, is embedded in our cultures. The idea that if you can get through that night, and as soon as the sun rises, something is going to it's going to get better. It's going to be okay. Now, obviously, there's kind of vampire stories where that's obvious, but even other stories. And one of the examples I look at in the book, for example, is To Kill a Mockingbird, which we don't think of as in any way a kind of horror story or a crime story, but when bad things are about to happen to the children in that, we're told over and over again about how dark it's become, how dark it is, how they can't see. And I think that repetition the whole time in our cultural lives around darkness being connected with bad things happening, with crime, with accidents, is bound to have a knock-on effect in our psyches. We see it everywhere we look. So it's very hard then to stand back and say, hang on, is this actually true?
Before I throw it back over to Mark, I want to ask you one thing. I think the fear of the dark is actually genetic. I don't think it's taught. I think the base fear of the dark is genetic. And I talked to a bird expert, and he explained to me that the ability of birds to navigate by the stars is genetic. They're born with that ability. The turtles, they're born with the ability to look for the moon and go towards the moon in the water. And so a lot of this we don't control. Are we smart enough to admit that we're a species that has limitations and problems created by our own innate fears and things that we're born with? Are we ready for that, Jacqueline?
Some of us might be. I'm not going to generalize.
I don't think we think about ourselves as a species. I don't think we think about ourselves as a species. We think about ourselves as above the species of the world. But we're diurnal. We're supposed to be awake during the day and sleeping at various times of the night. And then when we change these environments, we change it at our peril. Mark, I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, Michael, that's a super interesting observation because I think as a society, we, at least in the US, we have this idea that we can do anything, go anywhere, anytime, as fast as we want, and there's really no limits. So Elon Musk wants to put us on Mars. It's a great fantasy, but you know what? There's a lot of radiation out there. There's a lack of oxygen. There's a lot of issues with going and living and populating Mars. And maybe just humans are just not really evolutionarily biologically compatible with Mars. So this idea of light pollution and I'm not sure. So if we light it are we headed towards a world where it's just lit 24/7 and we'll just have to adapt? Will humans need to just evolutionarily adapt to a 24/7 lit world?
Well, I would say, before we go to Jacqueline, I'd say the answer to that question right now is yes. We are headed towards a world that's massively polluted with electric light. It goes up at 10% a year, and it's super affordable now with LEDs because there's not that much electricity to use, Jacqueline. In your book, do you propose any solutions? Do you have any idea, or is it more of a somber reflection?
I don't propose solutions. It's very much a kind of personal exploration, really, of what darkness might mean. I'm interested in the various kind of phases of darkness. So I spend quite a lot of time, for example, looking at dusk. So that transition phase between day and night, and actually the dawn as well. But I look particularly at dusk and why that's important to us. So you were talking about us as species, as animals, and that period of dusk is particularly important for us on a physical level in terms of the way in which our hormones work and the way in which our brains work. And I think in some ways, while I absolutely accept what you were saying about a sort of 24/7 culture, I think it's those transition phases of dusk and dawn that are often most lost out on. So I pose questions in the book, for example, about how many of us can actually say, well, the sun has set now, because it's not the kind of thing we notice anymore, because it gets a bit dark, so we turn a light on. But actually, it's those middling phases of darkness which can be just as important as what we think of as kind of proper darkness, so the middle of the night. And again, sort of thinking culturally, those have been over time very important transition phases for poets and artists, for example. And I really enjoy a good dusk. I think we all really enjoy a good dusk, don't we? And I live on a west coast, so I am quite often aware of the sun setting into the sea, which is fantastic. But I think those kind of moments are increasingly lost. We're increasingly unaware of things like birds roosting, the way birds sing during dusk, the changes to colour that occur in dusk, the way that sort of blue becomes more prominent. So all these things that are very subtle shifts. I think it can become very difficult to be aware of those now.
I think there's a physiological damage for not being like, I don't believe that these things are non-consequential. I think that there is physiological damage.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's very true. And my understanding is that research on that is at quite an early stage. So there is significant research out there already to show how important dusk and the dark is to things like our circadian rhythms. So the way in which we interact with the day and night, and how important that is to hormone production, and how the things like the disruption of hormones or the disruption of circadian rhythms have effects on our tendency to have conditions like diabetes or cancer or mental health problems like depression, for example. So there are already clear links being made between the disruption of night and darkness and the destruction of dusk and our bodies. And I think because the research is at a reasonably early sort of stage in the life cycle of research, that probably more evidence will appear along those lines as time goes on.
So there's a couple. Mark's gonna get really upset here in a second about what I'm going to tell you. So the lighting industry believes, there's a lot of people in the lighting industry believe, that we can actually create positive health effects using LED lights, and we can mimic the sun. And in my journey, over 500 podcasts with lighting experts, scientists, a lot of the top people all over the world, what I found is that we can only do harm with electric light, and that we have to focus on harm reduction with electric light. And the second point that I've discovered is, and what you're talking about with the dusk, is this idea of cueing people to do things. And so what they've discovered is that lighting is a very powerful way to tell people what to do without saying anything. So Andrea Wilkerson, a prominent researcher in the field for Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, has discovered that you can get the visitors in hospital rooms to leave by warming and dimming the lights. You can get mothers and babies to wake up without any strain or stress by just slowly turning the lights on and warming at a very warm temperature and slowly increasing the color temperature. That anecdotally makes sense to anybody. The sun is rising and the sun is setting. People look at their watches when the sun starts to set. What time? Oh, maybe it's time to go. It's getting dark in here. And so you're talking about this cueing. I would assume that there's a physiological element to this cueing, which tells us it's time for you to go to sleep. It's time for you to go back home and rest now. And the disruption of this cascades into all manner of different kinds of problems, Jacqueline. So, I think your intuition is pointing to something that is needs to be researched more. Let's put it that way, Jacqueline.
Yeah, and I would agree. And one of the personal impulses behind the book was my dad's experience of dementia. And I was very interested in how he became very sensitive to light and dark, and to darkness in particular, and dusk. And of course, most people who have lived with someone with dementia will have come across what's known as sundowning, which is that period, usually around dusk, when the person with dementia often becomes very agitated or anxious or angry or tries to leave the house. And I think that's exactly what you were saying about cueing being instinctive. For people with serious dementia who are not looking at the dark in any kind of conscious way, there's still an instinctive response to the fact that darkness is approaching, and their body is changing in response to that. And that comes through in this case as something quite urgent. They realize that something needs to be done. Quite often they just don't know what that is because of the illness. And that's a very, very common condition within dementia, I think.
Mark, we're coming up on time here, 4 minutes left. Do you have any final questions or comments for Jacqueline?
Well, what a great show. The queuing thing, that's the first time I've heard that phrase. When these LED streetlights started to come out, for me, it wrecked that sunset. So I too was really tied to that sunset. It was the best time of day for me personally. So I looked forward to it. And when the LED streetlights started coming out, these little white lights started to appear, and it was wrecking my scene. It was really mentally disturbing for me. So, I hope that we can do something about, this queuing thing, and to say, hey, it's time to go to sleep. It's actually, it's not time to just keep going. So that's all I have to say.
Jacqueline, it's been wonderful to have you. Your new book is coming out. Is it out yet? It says coming out in November. Has it hit the shelves?
It's out. You are.
There it is there.
Yep.
Okay. Is it available in North America?
I don't know the answer to that. You would have to go online and have a search around. Let's hope so.
Okay. And so, Scott, can you note to look it up on Amazon and all the Barnes & Noble and all that, and post those links to the Restoring Darkness podcast website? Okay. And we thank Jacqueline Yallop for being a guest today on the show. And I want to remind you, just before we go, of the Lighting and Darkness Foundation, new 501c3 created by the lighting industry. That's right. Lighting industry professionals are getting together and saying we have to do something about this issue of light pollution. There's too much of it out there. And maybe Mark Beaker doesn't agree with me, but we think it's a solvable environmental issue, or at least a mitigatable environmental issue that we can work towards as an industry. It's time to admit it. If we don't do it, lighting industry, it's going to be done to us. So why don't we just take the bull by the horns, and we can all get rich selling light fixtures that restore darkness and preserve night. If you want to help out, we need help. We need help with our website. We need help with our social media. There's lots of different ways to give. Another way is to donate. So if you go to restoringdarkness.com, click the donate link, you can become a monthly donor. We don't have one yet, and we're going to come up with a prize for the first monthly donor. Remind me for the next show, Scott. The first monthly donor is going to get a prize. So go to restoringdarkness.com. And of course, we're going to find Jacqueline's book, and we're going to put it on the Restoring Darkness podcast website. Thank you for listening.
Look no further for dark sky friendly products than Evluma. Since its first product launch, Evluma has carried one or more International Dark Sky Association certified models. If your customer cares about light pollution, suggest the OmniMax with shielding or the Area Max with full cutoff to reduce uplight and glare. Evluma, illuminating the pursuit of darkness.